Hello, and welcome back to the University of Guelph Debate Club podcast, where we challenge ideas, spark dialogue, and explore the intersections of activism, scholarship, and critical thought. I'm your host, George, and today's episode is especially meaningful to me, not just as the previous club's president, but as someone deeply invested in the study of race, education, and power. We're honored to welcome back a returning voice to the debate club, Professor Deirdre McCorkindale. Professor McCorkindale is a historian whose work spans Black settlement in southwestern Ontario, the Jim Crow era in North America, and the insidious legacy of scientific racism in Canadian education. Her work includes researching the Tanser Study, a 1930s racial intelligence test conducted on Black children in Kent County, and its broader implications on Black educational history. In this episode, we'll be diving into several key themes: the myth of Canadian racial innocence, the weaponization of education, the erasure of Black activism, and the power of oral history in challenging dominant narratives. Whether you're a student, an educator, or just someone who wants to understand Canada beyond the sanitized history books, this conversation is for you. To begin our conversation, I want to start with something both deeply local and deeply disturbing, the Tanser Study. This research project conducted right here in Ontario racialized Black intelligence under the guise of scientific objectivity. Professor McCorkindale, would you take us back to that moment and walk us through what the study claimed and what it really revealed?
Okay, so the study itself is not, it's actually not that remarkable. Um, what makes it remarkable is that it's Canadian and the particular population that he studied. So, the Tanser Study, also known as the settlement of Negroes in Kent County and a study of the mental capacity of their descendants, which is a very long title, but that is the title. Although if you look at the front of the book, it just says Kent County Negroes on the front of it, which is very kind of deceiving. So if you were to pick it up if you were to see an older copy at a library, which you are likely to do because it's all over the place, it's probably at the very least, it's probably at an Ontario university near you in the bookshelves somewhere, usually next to some of the Black history stuff. So if you were to like actually pick it up, you wouldn't know looking at it until you opened it. Um, so this was a study that was done in the late 1930s by the superintendent of schools in Kent County. And if for those of you who don't know, Kent County is the area that is located about halfway between Windsor and London. So it's at the halfway point. And the author was the superintendent of schools there, so abuse of power to a certain degree. But there wasn't really, they didn't have ethics boards back then. This entire study was probably an ethics board's nightmare. But this study was performed in order for the author to receive a doctorate in pedagogy, so teaching. Teaching education from the University of Toronto. And basically, what he did was he did a series of mental intelligence tests on the children in his care. The argument that he made was that he had the perfect test group because Kent County, in comparison to other places in Canada, had a still small for us, but in comparison to other places, it had like a fairly large Black population in some of the different cities and like areas of the county. And basically, his argument was that these children, unlike children in the Black children in the United States, specifically Southern Black children. He doesn't comment very much on Northern Black children, which I find very, very interesting because that's actually a better comparison for his study. So I think that that's a very interesting omission. But his argument was that the children under his care had not experienced the same kind of racial prejudice that Southern Black children had experienced, and that they had this like long history, basically this long history of white benevolence in the county. And he spends the first three chapters outlining a very rosy picture of what Black life in the 19th century was, because his argument was not only did the children under his care as superintendent have like relative racial equality in the 1930s, he was arguing that they had experienced like kind of generations of like British benevolence, um, because Canada is a British colony. So that is his basic argument. And he argued that essentially the Black children who he tested, they scored lower than the white children. He argued that this suggested that there was a correlation between biology and intelligence. And the reason that he did this again is because he was responding to he was responding to other intelligence tests at the time, who had been very heavily criticized, because most people who are looking at intelligence tests by the 1930s were like, well, how can you measure the intelligence of Black children who are like disproportionately affected by Jim Crow racism? He argued that he didn't have that problem. So he was trying to thread the needle of that particular issue that had always been a thorn in the side of scientific racists, because he argued that he had the perfect test group. Now, obviously, a lot of the things that he claimed about Kent County weren't true. The area was very heavily segregated. There were like problems within the school system, bias, and things like that. There's all kinds of things to consider. But again, his main argument is not that remarkable. That's what most racist scientists argued. You know, they skewed the tests in their favor. I don't even know exactly how he would have performed the test. There's all kinds of questions that we could have about them. The testing and the results themselves are not that interesting, and I'm not that interested in them because he's pretty boring in that respect. The interesting part is that kind of Canadian benevolence aspect of it.
Wow. Uh, how do you see the legacy of scientific racism still shaping educational policies or assumptions about Black students in Canada today?
So it's interesting. I was asked to speak to a group of Black graduate students a few weeks ago for their kind of year-end event. And like these are graduate students, like some of them are in like neuroscience and physics, and like they're doing all of these amazing things. And I was talking to them a little bit about my dissertation. Um, and about like the history of like intelligence testing and stuff like that, because I was asked to talk about my career, and we all ended up kind of having a conversation about the ways in which they are still treated within the education system. There are all these ideas that are still floating around. And yes, these are all like graduate students at a Canadian university, Black graduate students. So they are by definition graduate students. They have proven their worth to be here. They are the best of the best. And yet we were all having like conversations about, you know, the ways in which Black intelligence is disbelieved and having to constantly kind of fight those things. Even a couple of people had talked to me about like, even though it seems like we're like kind of far removed from it, we're not. The idea of like head shape and skulls and like who has a bigger head and who has a bigger brain, that still came up in conversation. And like it's upsetting because like the measurement of skulls, like that's a 19th century issue, and we're still kind of dealing with it. Um, And the statistics kind of prove this. Like, I don't have any of them in front of me, unfortunately, for your podcast, but like, you can look these things up. In our education system, Black students are disciplined more harshly, they're tested more harshly. Like, it's harder for them to advance. And some of it comes from like these preconceived ideas about what intelligence is. And um, like there are a lot of assumptions that are made about like Black students, um, about whether or not they can advance and where they can advance and all of these things that kind of play into things. And like it's to a certain extent, like there's aspects of it that I'm just speaking from the Black perspective because that's what my dissertation is about. But stereotypes about intelligence affect multiple population. They affect women, they affect people who are on the spectrum, they affect, like all different groups of people. And in some ways, they can kind of turn things into a self-fulfilling prophecy because if everybody tells you that you're dumb, sometimes you start to believe it and you don't always try as hard and you get upset and you're frustrated and there are less resources and you don't necessarily see something like university as you know viable for things. It's it's a pretty it's a pretty tough legacy and we're constantly dealing with it. The thing with the especially I can't speak on other types of intelligence testing, but racial intelligence testing, what I discovered as I was going through the history of scientific racism is that especially for Black folks, which is who I chose to focus on, but I would imagine you might find the same story for different groups of marginalized people as well. With this kind of science, you are constantly playing a game of whack-a-mole because even when you think that you've defeated it, it comes back again. Just to kind of give you an example, um, when so in the early 1920s, there was testing that was done on World War I soldiers. And this is in the United States. And they were done on Black soldiers, but they were also done on various ethnicities as well. And the conclusion was not only were Black folks unintelligent by these studies, but also Southern Europeans who they didn't want in the country at the time. So we're talking about like Italians, Eastern Europeans. Um, and they tried to argue those things. And this was a very, very popular study, and it influenced some of the US's very first like actual immigration policy that they ever had. And it was a draconian policy in the 1920s. So out of that, a Black educator kind of came in, and his name was Horace Bond. And I'm forever grateful to him because he really helped inform my study. He wrote for The Crisis, which is, if you don't know, The Crisis was the journal that the NAACP published. And he wrote this article called Intelligence Tests and Propaganda, where he ripped through this test and like all of the things wrong with it and all of these other things. And along with that article, a group of really good psychologists and sociologists started fighting back and saying, you can't do this, you can't test this. And they became the norm. And in fact, they are what Tanser was trying to fight against. But the thing is, so Horace M. Bond writes that article in The Crisis in the 1920s. By the 1960s, he's having to do it again because it comes up again. It goes in cycles, and it's like you constantly have to beat it back because I don't think that we have, as a culture, have like fully grappled with like intelligence testing and really thought about what intelligence actually is. Because I don't know what intelligence is, and nobody does. How can you measure something like intelligence? You can't. But I think that that's a huge issue is you're constantly having to fight it. Like some of my I have students here because I teach in the Black Studies program. So I actually get a lot of like Black psychology students. And like this year they told me there's a new one. There's a new one. There's a new one that says that, according to statistics, Black folks are not, they're not as intelligent. There's a new one. There's always a new one. When I was growing up in the 90s, it was the bell curve, and people still cite the bell curve. That was the big one when I was a kid. So it constantly goes in cycles. Now again, I'm speaking to you from the Black perspective because that's what I've studied. The same is true for a lot of other marginalized groups. That's, I think an important thing for people to remember is that this doesn't like this kind of stuff, like this is about hierarchy and maintaining control and who gets to be considered part of the in group and who doesn't, and who gets to be intelligent and who doesn't. This affects more than just Black folks. This affects all kinds of like marginalized people. And it's a constant thing that we're having to deal with. Gender is a huge issue with it as well. Like, testing, like, oh, women are not as intelligent as men according to these tests, or women have this kind of intelligence and men have this kind of intelligence, like making that like very stark binary as if that's how people work. And that's not how people work. It's putting people into boxes, and that doesn't work. I'm sorry, I'm rambling again.
No, no, no. This is very interesting stuff and stuff I have not known. And it's very telling, especially how it's cyclical in nature. This racist system that's within
Yeah, yeah. In the 19th century, this is like basically the argument I make. So basically, what we have is a transition. In the 19th century, um, scientists are very concerned about the physical, at least when it comes to human beings. They're very concerned about the physical. So, like what I can physically, like, kind of see. So, when it comes to intelligence, they are starting to understand, although not in the best way, they're starting to understand that, the mind, the brain is the big focal point. Well, they're obsessed with the physical. So, they become like obsessed with the skull, and they literally start measuring skulls, and they rob graves, they rob indigenous people's graves, they rob Black folks' graves, people from all over the world. They rob their graves and they measure their skulls, trying to prove a hierarchy, trying to do those things. And then there's like all kinds of arguments that some of them have over like how you measure the skull. Do we put mercury in the skull cavity to measure it? Do we measure the outside? Do we put rice? Do we put pepper? Do we put mustard seed? Like all of these like stupid, like arbitrary things. And then when we get to the 20th century, it's less about the physical, but it's about what's inside the head. So we're still measuring the head, we're just measuring it a different way. Um, but it's constant
Mhm.
because there's always people trying to find a way to scientifically prove hierarchies. And you have to be very suspicious of those things, because, like, Frederick Douglass is arguing with these people in the 19th century.
Mhm.
And then Horace Bond is arguing with them in the early 20th century. And then Otto Kleinberg is arguing with them in the mid 20th century. And now it's 2025 and I'm arguing with these people, like it's a constant issue. No, it's like, is it the only issue to like when it comes to like inequality in our society? No. But like it is something that we should probably talk about a little bit more.
Mhm. 100% agree. Um, the history of pseudoscience leads naturally into another theme. We wanted to explore the long, complicated relationship between race and education in Canada.
Mhm.
While many Canadians pride themselves on being more progressive than our southern neighbors, your research tells a more sobering truth.
Mhm.
Let's talk about Black education in Ontario, especially in the 19th century.
Okay. So Black education in Ontario in the 19th century is really interesting in that it's kind of a mixed bag. So I want to be really clear, because like sometimes this is something that can happen because of the way that Canada is and the way that it treats Black folks. Sometimes there's like an impulse for us to talk about how racist everything was in Canada. And then it makes it seem as though being Black in Canada was this like endless drudgery and there was no fun to be had. And and it wasn't necessarily. So I just want to be really clear, like Black folks like do have a life outside of white supremacy. But since you've asked me about like this particular issue, so education in Ontario at the time in the 19th century, so this would be the 1900s, just because some people don't know. Um, Canada, Ontario would have been called Canada West or Upper Canada. That you're, it depends on who you read, but that's what it was called before it was Ontario. And Black education in Ontario is really, really interesting because we had a lot of segregation in Ontario or Canada West at the time. However, most of the segregation that we had in Ontario was what we call de facto segregation. So, de facto segregation essentially means there's not a law necessarily, but it is routinely practiced. Um, Education, however, is one of those few areas where we actually had legislation about segregation. So, in the 1850s, so 1850 to be exact, the um, Common Schools Act was put forward by Egerton Ryerson. So that's part of the reason that Toronto Metropolitan University has since changed its name. It's not the only reason, but it is part of it. Egerton Ryerson had put together the Common Schools Act, and it was to like regulate like the education system in Canada West. And it's honestly just a tiny little clause that exists, but that's all it takes. Um, so I believe it's clause 19 of the Common Schools Act. And so basically, there's a clause 19, that allows for um, originally what it was supposed to be for was so that Protestant and Catholic denominations could establish their own schools because a lot of schools were religious based at this particular point in time. We hadn't gotten to like kind of our secular 20th century part yet. Um, and the Protestant Catholic thing makes a lot of sense because of French Canada's influence and all of these other things, right? So that's originally what it's for. The problem is that very quickly there was another one tacked onto it. It was also schools for people, they would have called them colored at the time. Usually, if you see the word colored, it usually refers to Black folks. It sometimes can refer to other groups of people who we would identify as visible minorities in Canada. But usually, if you're looking at the 19th century, if it specifically says colored, it is referring to Black people in particular. Um, and so that was established. And basically, what happens from it is that clause is not necessarily a mandate that all schools be segregated. This is the thing, it's complicated, right? It's not a mandate that all schools be segregated based on race. What it does say, though, is that if there is a colored school that exists, that Black children can be compelled to attend the school. So, what ends up happening across Ontario because of this is, again, you have a mixture. There are areas of Ontario that did not have segregated, that had Black populations, or at least some Black people in them, that did not have segregated schools. There are some, like, so it's not across the board. But what ends up happening is even before this legislation, there were Black schools that were established in Ontario. And the reason those schools were largely established is because the white populations in like particular municipalities would not allow Black children to attend the schools. So this puts the Black folks in a unwinnable situation. Basically, and this is a huge fight within the Black community because by and large, most Black folks do not, if we look at the records, most Black folks in all the communities in Ontario, they did not want to be segregated. They wanted their kids to go to school with the white kids. Like, that's not the thing. The issue is that Black parents run up against is, do we keep fighting these people for the right to go to an integrated school? How long is that going to take? How long is my kid going to sit here while we're waiting for them to act right? And then on top of it, there were also concerns of, if my kid does go to the white school, is like, are they going to be accepted? Are they actually going to get an education there? Because like there's all of these issues. And so there are Black schools that are begrudgingly established. Some of these Black schools are amazing and they are better than some of the white schools, depending on where you go. Usually those schools are run specifically by Black people and their abolitionist friends, and they get funding, right? Those ones are great. There's also a ton of subpar schools because this is what segregation does, right? Mm-hmm. And it leads to all of these things. My community, in particular, it's very, very interesting. So I'm from the community that Tanser wrote his study about. I'm from Kent County. So Kent County has three major Black populations. There's obviously others in like the country and stuff like that. But we had major population in Chatham, which is the city in the area. Dresden, well, what is now Dresden? It was Dawn at the time. And then North Buxton, which was the Elgin settlement at the time. In those areas, we had some amazing schools, but we also had some really crappy ones too. Interestingly enough, just to give you an example from Chatham, which is where I was born, in Chatham, we had a segregated school that was granted to us by the city. It was awful. And people complained about it all of the time. And it was suggested that, the teachers who would have been fired at any other school got sent over there. And I think there was an issue with the water or something there. And there was an issue with the windows and stuff over there. But in contrast, there was another school that was built by the community, the Wilberforce Institute, and that was meant to send Black kids to university, but that was built by the community. Mm-hmm. Like, so you get a contrast, and segregation is a huge fight within the Black community because there are Black folks who say, Marian Shad Carey is one of them. She's quite famous now. She's one of them. She writes in her newspaper, the Provincial Freeman, like quite frequently, how much she hates segregation and that we shouldn't put up with this, that like we should not put up, like we shouldn't accept these colored schools. We shouldn't do that. But the other side of the coin is, again, how long do we have to wait? And again, like the thing is, I don't know what the answer is because there wasn't necessarily a right or a wrong answer because in many ways, Marianne Shad was absolutely right about it. But on the other hand, how long did the community have to wait for their children to be educated? And it's a huge issue. Now, I think in Ontario, our last segregated school for, at least for Black students, I think they closed that in, I want to say the 60s. But this goes on for quite some time. So you kind of get a mixed bag, but you kind of have to look at, when we're looking at segregation, like each individual community. And what you usually find is the more Black people there are in a community, the more likely there is hostility and the more likely to find a segregated schools. Now, this is not always the case, but it is often the case because there was a traveler And he actually like wrote down, like he actually interviewed quite a few people in Canada, and one of them said like basically something to the effect of one or two black folks is interesting and a curiosity for the white folks, but more than that is a problem.
Mhm.
And we kind of see that across the board. I hope that I answered your question about it's complicated.
Mm.
It's really complicated. It depends on the community that you go to about the segregated schools, but the segregated schools themselves are always an issue. The segregated schools that were built by the Black community, they're these, some of them are like kind of these amazing structures of like kind of Black resilience, but you do have to think about the fact that they were largely built because of the hostility of the white community. So like even the good schools, they're built they're built in the shadow of this issue, this like kind of like resistance to integration. And we in Canada don't always want to have those, we don't always want to have those conversations because we look at things like segregation as like that's a problem that happens in other places. um I was once asked to talk at a local community event. So this would be in my hometown where the segregated schools were. I was asked to come in and talk about the schools, and most of my talk was like, this is for like a community event. Most of my talk was fairly positive. Like I didn't really get into like, all of the harshness and everything like that. It was mostly me talking about how like I really admired the community for coming together and building these schools, right? The amount of people who came up to me afterwards, like specifically like older white people, to try and refute me about the segregation was actually quite alarming. Because the thing is, I had to talk about segregation in this talk, at least a little bit, because I had to explain why the schools were there. Like, I can't get around the segregation issue. And they proceeded to tell me, like, when they went to school, everybody was equal and everybody was the same, and like all of these other things. And all I kept thinking was, well, first of all, I was talking about like the 1800s, and like these ladies were not that old, right? But like, I was talking about the 1800s because my community actually desegregated a lot sooner than other places in Ontario.
Mhm.
But like, there was this, I think that's part of the problem when we're having these discussions about like education and um, the history of Ontario and things like that. It's not just me, like, telling you a troubling history. It's that some people are not always necessarily prepared to hear it. And I understand that to a certain degree. Like it sucks hearing that, like it sucks that hearing a community that like perhaps that you grew up loving, and perhaps to find out that there were things that you didn't see. Um, and some people take it in strides and want to learn, but some people they internalize it and they take it personally, and they really shouldn't, because it wasn't, it wasn't like a personal thing that I was talking about. Like nobody living now is responsible for segregation in the 1800s. I will say this, we have advanced at least a little bit to know that like segregation, like we've moved on from that, but like there is still that like kind of defensiveness. Like we don't want to think about that past. And like it is there, and it does inform like the current education system, whether we want to admit it or not. Like we had segregated education here. And of that's to say nothing of what education has done to like our indigenous populations as well. Like I'm just talking about like a very small population. Like this is just what happened to a very small population. But like thinking about on like a larger scale, like, you know, education is supposed to be the solution to everything. And it hasn't always been, which is an interesting thing for me to say as an educator.
As we explore the structural barriers faced by Black communities, it's also crucial we uplift the stories of resistance.
Mhm.
Whether through education, activism, or cultural resilience, Black communities have continually pushed back. Professor McCorkindale, who are some of the figures or moments in Ontario's history that you think deserve more visibility?
So for education, I'll just talk about my community because like I'm very firmly centered there. This is kind of what I was getting at, where like I don't want to necessarily portray like Black living in Ontario as this like horrible drudgery because it isn't. Even though some terrible things happened in my community, I'm still extremely proud, and I wouldn't be from anywhere else if you paid me. So in my little city in Chatham and in like the surrounding areas, the Black communities, they were subjected to segregated schooling. They were subjected to segregated schooling before before the Common Schools Act even made it legal. Like the city just kind of did that to them. And they hated it and they kept fighting it. Um, and they built, and in the midst of fighting it, they built like some amazing educational institutions. The Buxton Mission School, which was located in North Buxton, that school was so amazing that the local white schools had to close down because everybody wanted to go to that school. That school produced doctors, teachers. It sent Black children to college. And I know that that seems like probably nothing to a modern audience, but you have to understand in the 19th century, the idea of giving Black children anything for education besides like manual labor, that was something that they did. Like Josiah Henson is a huge inspiration to me. He was born enslaved in Maryland. I think it was in Maryland. He was in Maryland. He went to Kentucky. I always kind of mix that up a bit, but he was born enslaved. He escaped to Canada with his entire family, carrying two of his children on his back. And when he got here, he eventually helped start the community at Dawn, which is in modern day Dresden, which is where my grandfather is from. And while he was there, he helped establish a school called the British American Institute. And they taught adults as well as children there. They did crafts work. And he was able to go to the World's Fair in England and display the work of those Black workers, the woodworking that they had done there. Um, and I'm extremely proud of my community because even though we had the segregated schools, we desegregated sooner than most of the other places in Ontario because the communities came together to fight segregation. And in the 1890s, it stopped. Now, we still had a school and community center where I'm from, but all of our schools always allowed people, regardless of race. It was the white schools that were exclusionary. And I think that's something and I think every Ontarian should be proud of because, yeah, I'm Black and I'm from this community, but this is part of every Ontarian's history. Those Black schools did not exclude white children. And I think that that's something to be proud of as well. Like
Mhm.
some of our schools in one of our schools, we had a vocational school in the early 1900s. We taught radio and broadcasting at a time when like nobody was teaching that. And it was a Black man, Harold Jackson, who helped start our very first radio station in Toronto, like not in Toronto, in Chatham. There's so many of these stories, and I'm just giving you my own from my own community. We have a very long and rich history of education, which is really interesting because like we don't always think about that for Black communities because it's always about like denial of education. But all of the Black communities in Ontario have been like a very, very long line of fighters, and they've gone on and done like some really, really amazing things. And you just have to look in your own backyard and you'll find them. So those are just some examples, like based in education, because you asked me an education question, um, from my own community. My community was a activist community. It was an abolitionist community. John Brown came to my community to recruit people. Like when there was a need, the community met the need. And anytime like a school shut down or a community center was lost or something else was built from the ashes. Anytime the community needed something, it got done. And I think that's kind of the most inspirational thing about it. And I think that's something that Ontario, people in Ontario should be proud of. Not just me because I'm a Black person, like everybody in Ontario should be proud of, instead of like, I know saccharine sweet histories make you feel good, or at least they make some people feel good, but they're not real. The really good history is finding those people who stood against a system and made something really good. And Ontario's full of those stories, and I think that that's the best part of that history is, and I think that's the best way to look at, and at least that's how I look at segregation in the kind of Black oppression stories in Ontario, is that they're terrible. We should know about them, but at the same time, they're also extremely inspiring for like what people did in the face of it. I hope that I answered your question. Sorry.
Yeah. No, yeah, that answers it. Yeah. I You've written and spoken about the Underground Railroad,
Hmm.
but also about the erasure of Black Canadian activism. Why do you think that erasure persists?
Okay, so the erasure persists because it's an old practice, right? Old habits die hard, and it's a part of the Canadian identity. So full disclosure, I grew up in an underground railroad. Like a lot of these, I don't know if you've noticed this, a lot of this is very personal for me.
Mhm.
Um, so Chatham was one of the major stops on the Underground Railroad. It just was. There was at one point in time, like by the mid 1850s, Chatham had one of the largest Black populations in Ontario. One third of the population was Black. Um, so, you know, this is kind of a big thing for me. So it was a big, like, it's a big part. It was also like the Underground Railroad is a story that we tell to children, unfortunately. When I talk to my students, because I teach a Black Canadian history course, and this makes me sad that this is still the case, because I had hoped things had gotten a little bit better. Usually at the beginning of the year, I go around and I've made them read some sort of article about, studying Black history in Canada. And I go around and inevitably, without me asking, it always comes up. And I talk to like different groups of students, and the same thing keeps coming up is I never learned anything about Black people in Canada. I never learned anything about Black people in Canada. And sometimes somebody will say, well, I learned about the Underground Railroad. But they always tell me once we get to the Underground Railroad, when I'm teaching it, they didn't teach it to me like this.
Mhm.
And they get taught it as children. So not only is the story that we tell of the Underground Railroad, the story that we tend to tell of the Underground Railroad is this very, very saccharine, sweet story of poor Black huddled masses. Usually they have no names. It's just this like mass of Black people coming to Canada, usually assisted by friendly white people, usually Quakers. I'm not saying the Quakers aren't a part of the Underground Railroad, they are, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. But they're helped by these white people, and then like Canada welcomes them with open arms. And then that's the end of the story. We don't talk about them as people. We don't talk about what their lives were like when they were here. We don't talk about them. They are a vehicle for Canada to kind of discuss its benevolence. And in that sense, it's a very unique story that is very important to the Canadian identity because we do teach our children about it. Because it's a story about how great Canada is. Look at what we did for these Black people, right? Um, but the story is more complicated than that, obviously, because most people, for most stories are anytime, and like this isn't a Canadian thing, this isn't an American thing. Anytime somebody tells you a story that sounds like overly sweet about any country's history, it's probably not true. There's probably something a little bit more to it than that. It's an interesting aspect of Canadian identity because Canada largely identifies, whether we like to admit it or not, as a white space with a very white history. That's how it likes to identify itself, despite efforts in the other direction. And that largely means the erasure of Black presence here, even though we've been here since the 1600s, recorded, right? However, in this one instance, this is the one instance where Black people show up, but we're not people. And we're just a very important piece of Canada's story. And what I've found in my research, because I used to think, because I grew up in an Underground Railroad community, I used to think naively that this overly sweet story of the Underground Railroad, I used to think that that was part of our, like, trying to superimpose our multicultural policy onto the past, right? That's what I used to think that it was. And for those of you who don't know, because I know you're doing this in a podcast, like our multicultural policy comes in late 1970s, early 1980s, right? And I thought that's what it was. I thought it was like this post-civil rights multicultural policy. We're trying to superimpose what we think now on the past and like trying to change history, right? And then I went back and I found that, oh no, that very like sweet story about like these like sad people who came up here and Canada just helped them so much and all of these other things. That goes back to the 1850s when they were coming here. There are the way that people write about Canada, and even in the 19th century, there was he's one of my favorite people. He was an American abolitionist, very problematic, but I love his work. He was tasked to come up to Canada. He was writing for the Freedmen's Commission for the United States, and he was tasked to come up to Canada, and he actually interviewed people in Ontario about what was going on here, both Black people and white people. And he actually talked about this very interesting phenomenon that he was experiencing, where a lot of the white people he would encounter tried to deny that racism was happening here. So even in the 19th century, this American guy is noticing they're trying to pretend like, oh, we don't have those problems here. And there would literally be people who said to him, we don't have that problem here. That's an American problem. That's your problem. If we have segregation here, it's because Americans are coming up here, like trying to like absolve themselves of any responsibility. All things that like modern people in Canada would be really familiar with. And they would say things like, everybody here is subject to the same laws and everybody is treated the same here. They were saying these things in the 19th century. So, you're asking me, this is my very long way of saying, you're asking me like why this has persisted. It's because it's been over 100 years that we've been doing this, and old habits die hard. And here's the thing. I understand why Canadians like the story, because it's a nice story because Canada gets to be the hero in the story. And it's unfortunate though, because they're missing out on a much cooler story, where Canada plays a part, but Canadians are more important rather than like this abstract idea of Canada.
Mhm.
The most important thing for people to know about the Underground Railroad, and this is something that I teach my students, and I have a lot of Black students who take the Black history course, and it makes me sad when I have to get to the Underground Railroad lecture because I love the Underground Railroad. Despite what I have written, where I'm very critical of the story, I love the Underground Railroad. I love that story. I love that history. But it makes me sad when I get to that lecture because I can see my Black students as I'm looking out, and I can see them as soon as they see the title rolling their eyes because they've been told that saccharine sweet story. And I have to start that lecture every time by saying, listen to me. I promise you, this story is worth your time.
Mhm.
And, you need to know about this. And I feel that every Canadian should take this story back because it's such a cool story, the things that people did in the face of adversity. And it's so much better than some story about how, well, people just got here and everything was fine. It's a cooler story than that. But I think that's why it's persistent because it's an easy story to tell people. It's a positive story to tell people. And here's the thing, you can still tell like an amazing positive story of the Underground Railroad and be truthful and still be proud of being Canadian. Like,
Mhm.
I'm not saying that people need to throw away, like, I want to be really clear. I'm not saying that people need to like throw away the Underground Railroad. I'm very proud of the abolitionist roots in my community. I just think that people should know about them rather than like this abstract idea of like, nothing ever happened here, those kind of things.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. I think, well, it's more important than ever to talk about this now, especially in the climate that we're in. I think
Mm,
times of crisis where you see, especially like US-Canada relations, how everything
mhm.
is marketed with Canada strong or this going forward with Canada, like elbows up, it
Mhm.
really is how the government markets itself rather than Canadians reclaiming a story that they should, really be advocating for rather than advocating for more political interests more than
Yeah,
like citizen interests.
yeah. It's a it's an amazing story, and Canadians should be proud of that story, but they should be proud of the real story. And the real story is that Black people run the Underground Railroad.
Hmm.
That's just the way that it is. White people help,
Hmm.
and they are a great help,
Hmm.
but they ran the railroad.
Hmm.
They built these communities. White people helped them sometimes. And like that's what makes it cool. And it makes it a cool kind of thing. But the thing is, though, if you want to have access to that story and you really want to be proud of it, you have to think of these people not as the stranger and you have to think of them as Canadians. And I think that we haven't done that completely yet because we still look at those freedom seekers as outsiders because they're Black.
Hmm.
But if you look at them as Canadians who helped build the infrastructure of several of the cities in Ontario, the story's a little bit different, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Mhm.
It's it's very weird how the Black perspective seems to be estranged from the Canadian perspective because that's something I've always seen in school. It's just like the Black perspective is so rich in American culture, but like in Canadian culture, it's so like out of body, at least within how I was taught in education. I know different places have different ways of teaching it, but
Yeah, but like that's the thing though with like that's the thing. It depends on where you're taught. Like sometimes you'll get really lucky and you'll have a teacher who really cares and
Mhm.
like puts the work in and stuff like that. But if you don't and you don't know, and it's okay, and like I want to be really clear to whoever you're going to end up having listening, it's okay, and it's always okay if you don't know these things because like our system is set up so you don't know. That's why, like people like me and people like some of my colleagues, like we try to put up like resources and things like you. That's why we have like courses. That's why like Black Canadian Studies exists. That's why we have all of those things. So if you want to know more, you can, but it's okay if you don't know.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I Uh, speaking of visibility, one of the
Mm,
tools that makes these histories come alive is oral storytelling.
mm,
You've worked with oral history as a way of documenting and preserving the truths that
mhm,
the archive often misses or erases.
mhm.
Let's talk about why oral history matters in academic and community contexts.
So I want to be really clear with something. Sometimes people go too much in one direction versus the other. There are some people who think that, like, because of the deficiencies um, within like minority groups, that oral history is just going to solve all of our problems. Like, we're just going to interview everybody and it's going to solve like all of the like gaps that we have in the knowledge. And that is not the case.
Mhm.
As somebody who does it, and I love doing it, it's not the be all and end all method. It is a tool that we have in our toolbox to use, and we should use it. And it's really, really useful. Also, like, doing oral history is really interesting for me. Now, I've only ever interviewed older people. I've never interviewed younger people. So I can't speak to like what that experience would be, but interviewing elders in the community is an amazing experience for somebody to have, just to, because you learn a lot about yourself while you're also learning a lot about them, but you get their perspective. And the thing is, most, especially if you're doing things in Ontario, most of the most of the newspapers, there were Black newspapers, but there's not a lot of them, and they only reach certain places. You don't always get, if you look into a traditional, like I guess what we consider a traditional archive, you don't always get the Black perspective. So I'll give you an example. A colleague of mine, her husband, he is in charge of the local Anglican church in Chatham, where I'm from. And that church was recently, a few years ago, they were having their 200th year anniversary. So that's how long that church has been there. It's obviously had work done since then, but that's how long that church has been there. And she started like kind of doing stuff in the archives. And then she decided that she wanted to have, she called it like a living library. These are really kind of cool events where like you can go, it's like a community event where you can go and you can check out people as books, right? And like they'll talk to you. And she wanted to do it with like some of the older people in the church and things like that. And then she thought about it and she was like, she asked my grandmother to come to the church because that Anglican church, which is mostly white and has almost always been mostly white, except for a few blips here and there, is very, very close to the Black neighborhood. And the interesting thing that she told me she found is that these are older people, and you got to remember, like, these two groups of people, like, the church is right next to the Black community. Like, it is like 3-minute walk away. These people would have grown up, and Chatham's not a big city. It's a city, but it's not a very big city. These people grew up in the same place. Their perspective on things is completely different. Like, the way that they were talking about their childhood versus the way that my grandmother was talking. And these are the same age people, and they lived in the same city. And my grandmother had to tell them, it may have been that way for you, but for us, it was different. Sometimes, sometimes when you talk to people and you interview people, it's really interesting to understand their reality. And you don't always get that. You don't always get that from like newspapers and things like that. And interviewing people is really interesting because they tell you about like all kinds of things that you as the historian, it's a very humbling experience. I will say that. Because sometimes, especially if you're an academic historian, you go in there and you're like, I'm trained at this and I know exactly what I'm going to ask them. They tell you things that you needed to hear that you didn't know.
Mhm.
And you need to go in understanding that you don't know everything. And sometimes that's a hard thing for academics to do. And I think that every academic should have to do that is, and I think it's important for people. I was just talking to a group about this in the community recently because we were talking about like strategies for academics to work with marginalized communities. Sometimes academics make assumptions that they know what is best. You know, to go back to like some of your questions about like IQ testing and things like that, right? Sometimes people at the top and people in like their ivory towers at educational institutions, they think that they know what is best for populations. You have to ask the people
Mhm.
because they know what they need and they'll tell you what they need and they'll tell you what's important. And when I started interviewing for my project, and I worked on several projects, not just my own, but when I started interviewing for my own project, I went in there with like a particular idea of like what I thought I was going to ask, but those people told me and gave me a really, really interesting perspective that shifted my entire viewpoint on the intelligence study that I was working on all of these other things. Oral histories have the ability to fill in gaps where we don't have one. Just to kind of give you an example, unfortunately, um, one of our baseball diamonds has been demolished. Well, it hasn't been demolished, but like what used to be there is no longer there.
Mhm.
Through oral history, I remember for one of the projects we did about our baseball team that had broken the color barrier, I went through, I remember I was sitting at the kitchen table with my grandmother, and she was describing to me what the park looked like. Is it perfect? No. Might she have misremembered exactly where the change rooms were and where the pool was? Maybe, but it's something rather than just like a bare, empty field. They fill in gaps. Now, again, I'm not going to tell you that like oral history is going to magically fix all of the problems and all of the holes. There are other methods that we can use to try and uncover these things, but getting Black people's perspectives on things and other marginalized groups, any group that you're studying, understanding the community that you're studying is really, really important, and actually talking to them, whether you're doing a history project or a you're doing like a project that's supposed to help them with their local park,
Mhm.
actually talking to them, because I'm not the only person who does like oral history or interviews. Lots of different groups do them. And I know that sounds like a very simple thing, but like literally just actually talking to the people is the important part.
That's very, very interesting to hear. Especially since I don't know that much about how historians take just different perspectives and how to piece those together and how oral histories kind of paint a picture, but sometimes there's conflicting informations from different sources as well too.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. The way to look at oral history is you need to look at it similarly that you would at any other source. There's a tendency, and like this is a problem of like white institutions. There's a huge tendency to look at a printed page and to say, this is the be all and end all of things. That printed page is sometimes just as biased and forgot just as much stuff. The intelligence study that I'm looking at, that's a book that was published. He lied about a lot of things, you know. His testimony is not necessarily like any better. So like, yeah, you need to approach any method that you're looking at with some scrutiny. Every method, every this is something that I teach in the Black um, research methods course. We study different ways of studying the Black experience. Every single one of them has problems. That's why you don't just use one, right? And you need to consider all of those things. Like, yeah, sometimes there's conflicting things. Sometimes, you know, sometimes people tell you things and you're not sure if that's entirely true. So then it's your job to go and verify it, you know, like it's an art and a science, basically.
well, yeah, it's very interesting to hear the how that works and also how to uh, just the typical way of how to also be problematic with something like oral history that would
Mhm.
not you'd have to use a um a more nuanced perspective
Yeah,
to analyze these. And yeah, I have one last section, and
sure.
then that's the end of my questions. But
Okay.
before we wrap,
I'll try to keep it brief. I'm sorry.
no worries. This conversation's going really well. I'm learning so much. It's really interesting. I'm just sitting in awe. Uh, before we wrap up, I want to bring up the conversation into the present of you've written powerfully about racism in Canadian universities,
Mhm.
including a sharp critique of the equity myth. As
Well, I reviewed that book and I liked that book very, very much.
um,
My review of that book was that it was right, not that I was critiquing the book.
as student and as educators today, what lessons can we take from history to inform how we move forward within academic institutions?
So I think the biggest thing, and like this is something that and I actually really recommend if you have a chance to read The Equity Myth because it was a privilege to review that book because it was very good. Something that they outline in something that they outline in The Equity Myth, which is something that I believe as well, is like part of the problem is we do teach in our culture that racism is bad, but we don't teach very much about like what it is, and it leads to a lot of problems. So part of the problem is we tend to teach students and adults alike that racism is a personal, like it's the result of a personal thing rather than like a large institutional thing. And we partially do that because it's easier, right? Like it's easier if you can just say like, oh, well, this is an immoral person, this is a bad person, right? And like, it's like you see this in movies all the time. I'm sure you've seen the movie. There's only one racist person in town, and if we just get rid of them, everything will be fine. That kind of thing. So we teach about racism as though like it's an individual problem. And I'm not saying that like people shouldn't be held personally responsible for their actions. That I'm not talking about that, but the problem is it doesn't necessarily fix systems. And one thing that we can learn from history is that these systems of hierarchy, not just racism, but sexism, homophobia, um, like discrimination against like neurodivergent people, things like that, right? One thing that we can learn from that history is that these are institutional problems. Prejudice against those people are institutional problems, and they are institutional problems that took many, many years to create. And we are not going to fix them with one policy. I would love it if we could fix, like, a lot of universities have like hiring initiatives for Black and Indigenous professors to come in. That's an important thing. I was a part of that. I think that's a really important thing. But sometimes, I'm not saying that this is what the university thinks, but there are people who outwardly think, okay, we've hired the Black professor. Now our problem is over. We want too much from one, we want like grand gestures that are going to fix the whole problem. They're not.
Mhm.
And we have to put effort into the programs that we have. So currently, just to kind of give you like kind of like a more recent example, currently the province is going to be mandating at least some Black history education in the schools. I don't know what that's going to look like just yet. I've been talking to a few of my friends who are teachers within like the public school system. Um, but like how that's going to look across the board yet, I don't know. Here's the thing. On the one hand, I think that that's a great idea. But on the other hand, here's my concern. Are we just saying that are we just saying that they need to check off a box and hoping that that will fix the problem? Because it won't. Effort has to be put in. It's not enough to go to an elementary school teacher and say, you have to teach Black Canadian history and then just leave him. to his own devices. He has no training in this. You give him no training, you give him no lesson plan, and just tell him he has to do this. That's not going to lead to a good outcome. This is something that I've seen with some of the Indigenous education that we've mandated, because on the one hand, I think it's a wonderful thing, and I think we should have did it a long time ago. But at the other hand, speaking to my students who are now in university, who have been part of those like mandates for Indigenous education, it is a wildly mixed bag what they received. Some of them had teachers who really cared and put in the work and put in the effort, but other ones, okay, read this book, and they have no training. And it's not entirely the teacher's fault. Like it's not enough to just ask a teacher to do this and then they have nothing to work with. Like that's a lot. These teachers are already overburdened. Are we going to give them a lesson plan? Are we going to teach them how to teach this? Are we going to do these things? And like this is what I'm saying. I think it's a good idea, but do we have the foresight, and are we going to put the effort in? And like that's the important thing to move forward. You know, like a lot of people in Ontario, just to give you an Ontario example, like we had the Fair Accommodations Act in 1954. So that basically desegregates public accommodations in Ontario, makes it illegal to deny somebody service on the basis of race, ethnicity, religion. I can't remember all of the ones that are in it, but like here's the problem. If nobody enforces it, and that did happen in the 1950s, and there had to be a huge fight about it in my neck of the woods in Dresden. You can pass laws, and these are really helpful, but if people don't enforce them, and the law is not going to be able to legislate people's feelings. Basically, what we've learned from history is that in order to solve these problems, you have to take multiple approaches, because the issues associated with racism, sexism, homophobia, all of these problems that we have to deal with, they are all very complicated. You cannot fix them with one thing, because it's never worked that way. You know, if we like look to the United States just as an example, just because it's foremost in everybody's mind right now. After the Civil War, there were a lot of politicians who literally thought ending slavery was enough. Oh, we're done. But then they didn't think about, oh, well, these people don't have access to this. These people don't have access to that. They haven't had access to education for generations. Like, there's all of these problems. Ending slavery is obviously a good thing, but it doesn't fix the entire problem. And it's the same thing when we're dealing with like policies to try and make our society more equal. We have to first acknowledge that we have an unequal system for many groups of people, not just Black folks. And I think that's an important thing to remember, because like sometimes it gets turned into an us versus them thing. This affects a lot of people, right?
Mhm.
In many different ways. We have to acknowledge that there is an issue, that it is old, and it took a long time to develop. That's actually one of my arguments in my dissertation, is that scientific racism, as we understand it, it doesn't like spring forward fully formed. It takes years to develop. These things take a long time to develop. And here's the thing, they also change over time. What racism looks like now is different, and it manifests differently than how it looked 50 years ago. And we have to acknowledge that. We have like particular ideas of like what we think racism looks like, right? We think that racism is, you know, the water fountain, you know, the famous pictures of like the colored water fountains and stuff like that. And something that I often tell my students, because I actually teach an entire course on Jim Crow, so like the Southern stuff that everybody demonizes, and rightfully so. I teach an entire course on that. I talk to them about prison slavery. I talk to them about segregation. I talk to them about all of those things. But one of the most important things I tell them at the beginning of the year is, listen, If this was just about me not being able to drink at the water fountain, same water fountain as you and I could all go home because you wouldn't need me. Because that's actually a relatively simple thing to explain. These people can't go over here. Segregation was how racism manifested after slavery ended, and segregation itself is a more visible representation of what was happening in Canada and in the United States and all around the world. It's just a manifestation. We still have like aspects of segregation now. It just exists slightly differently than it did. And again, these things are complicated. They're psychological, they're geographical, it's in the education system, it's in our workforce, it's our food systems. There is no, and I think, and this is like the sad thing, I wish there was. The important thing to remember is that there is no one size fits all policy to help everything. You have to tackle each problem incrementally. And we can't necessarily fix the past, but we can make things a little bit better now. And I hope that that made sense.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
I know something we did last episode and a reoccurring theme we have is I guess as the ending of the interview, um, is there anything you would like to promote that any courses you're a part of or any resources you think are beneficial that the listener should go and learn more about, or anything that you're passionate about and they should look into?
So if you're thinking about going to university, I know people don't like necessarily think of Guelph as like kind of like a black bastion of Black studies, but we here have the Black Canadian Studies minor program, and not that many universities have those kind of things. So I do want to promote that. One of my favorite courses that I teach is my research methods course. Um, I love my history course. I love teaching Black history, but unfortunately, because of the size of it, I don't always get to teach it the way that I want to. I don't always like talking at people. I like to talk to them and see how they feel about things. I love Black Canadian history. We offer that at University of Guelph. Um, but the big thing for me is I love the research methods course because that's the course where I get to actually sit down with my students and we talk about, like, rather than me just saying, all right, this happened and then this happened and this happened, I get to talk to them about, all right, this is how you do this. This is how you research the Black experience. If I was a psychologist, this is what I would do. If I was into food, this is how I would research the Black experience. Like, that's something that I'd want to, that's something that I'd want to promote. Um, I I've really enjoyed my time here, and I plan on staying here for a really long time. And the University of Guelph, while it is a very white school, I think it's a good school and it's moving in the right direction for things. It's doing some of the things that I was talking about, where we're thinking about putting in the work for kind of what needs to be done for kind of proper reconciliation and really kind of looking at answering some of these questions that you have. Um, and like in terms of like things for like recommendations, if you're interested in Chatham itself, like as like the area, there were some very wonderful young men who came to my town. If I'd have known that I was going to be in that documentary, I would have dressed nicer. I I originally thought that they were just doing something for a school project, but it has been aired on CBC. So it's an entire documentary about the Black community in the Kent County region called I think it's called Finding Black Mecca. I would recommend that if you're interested. But like the big thing I would recommend for your listeners is if you're interested in Black history, honestly, try and look in your own backyard. You might be surprised at what you might find. There's like Black communities all over Ontario, all over Canada. Um, the resources are out there if you want to go and look for them. So that's kind of the big, like, look to the local, because there's a whole lot of like Black folks in little communities like mine that are mostly made up of like old ladies who have all kinds of stories that they would love to tell you about all kinds of things. And I think that would be my biggest recommendation for them, is to like look at your local institutions and see what you can find.
Well, I'm very glad to hear that you're continuing and you have like a prosperous future in Guelph because it's truly been a blessing getting to get to know you and have you come to seminars because it's just changed my whole perspective of how I'm going into the future of academia. So I
Oh,
definitely
that's very sweet.
I wouldn't have thought of a different perspective and it opened my a lot of things that I did was not taught, you know?
Mhm. Well,
And
that's like
thinking.
that's partially what university is supposed to be for,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I
That's part of the reason we want people from all over the place, because we want you to learn different perspectives. Like I want kids from all over, and I
mhm.
want them to learn different kind of things. Like, yeah,
To wrap it up,
yeah.
Professor McCorkindale, thank you so much for joining us today and for continuing to do the work of truth telling, work that doesn't just reveal history but reshapes it. Your insights on race, education, and resistance offer both a challenge and an invitation to reflect on what kind of society we want to build. And to our listeners, if this episode stirred something in you, whether frustration, curiosity, or hope, we encourage you to lean into that. Read, question, organize, and most of all, listen, because change begins not just with knowledge, but with the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. This has been the Debate Club podcast at the University of Guelph. Stay curious, stay critical. Until next time.